Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Christian Leuprecht is a professor at the Royal Military College and Queen's University. He wrote a really interesting op-ed in the Globe and Mail about that we've got to reassure our American neighbors that Canada has their back. And he's our guest tonight. He's also the author of a recent book called Security, Cooperation, Governance, the Canada-United States Open Border Paradox. So obviously an expert on what's going on with the border. Christian Leuprecht, professor, welcome to the show.
Hello, Brian.
Hello. So tell me, the dreaded moment is how you start out your op-ed. What's the dreaded moment that's upon us?
So governments don't like what's known as linkage. That is to say, they don't like linking separate issues to one another in negotiations. So if we have a trade issue, softwood lumber, we negotiate a trade issue. If we have a border issue, we negotiate the border issue. If we have a defense issue, we negotiate the defense issue. And of course, the way the president-elect habitually does, he's blown that out of the water because he loves linkage, because that gives him significant leverage, especially as the United States, because the U.S. is always the bigger partner in these negotiations. And so, anything that the U.S. president might threaten might hurt the U.S., but is always going to hurt countries such as Canada a whole lot more. And so in this particular case, Canada had, for decades, kept these issues very separate. We either talk about trade or we talk about security, defense, but we don't talk about them together. We don't link them together. And after 9/11, that became a bit more difficult because the Americans wanted to talk about security. We talked about trade. And so we found this sort of entente where we kind of met sort of halfway. But now the president-elect has made it very clear that his threat of tariffs is based on his perceptions of Canada having become a threat vector, an illicit trade threat vector to the United States, that Canada will need to step up on national security, on the border, on defense, if it wants to have a serious discussion about having those tariffs mitigated or not imposed. And so
I think a lot of people, when they read his tweets about these big tariffs and his threats, thought, maybe there's fentanyl and illegal immigrants, migrants coming in from Mexico, but not from Canada. And then you raise a really interesting issue in your article. You say that the United States thinks that Canada has become a haven for transnational criminal organizations.
And it's important to understand that any one of these issues, the United States might say, okay, Canada just needs to get a grip on it. What you've identified is a host of different vectors that have now combined in the way they're being perceived in the US. And to some extent, there's also considerable truth to fact to what the United States is saying. Because, there's many ways to interpret this, but as we all know, security, defense, intelligence, border issues have not been a priority for the current federal government. These are all issues that require from any government sort of curated, regular attention. And as we know, attention to any policy issue by this government seems to be sort of in short supply. They're like sort of the shiny lure in the water. They just chase after whatever seems to be shining the brightest on any given day. And that's ultimately meant that a lot of these issues have fallen by the wayside. And the problem is, these are not things like, a tax issue or so where you can perhaps pass a budget and change a particular fiscal measure. These are things that take years to build and to course correct. And so now the government is really stuck in terms of what it needs to do, because it is, as I point out in my op-ed, there are things that Canada can do, and I think there's a number of things that the Trudeau government could be doing to appease the Americans and perhaps even negotiate away tariffs the way we did during the first Trump presidency, and of course after 9/11. We worked directly with the Americans. But the problem is, of course, when you have a government that is so distracted with its own infighting and has so many bushfires on the go in terms of policy issues that are falling apart, that ultimately means it won't give the attention to this file that's required. And I think that will end very, very badly for Canada.
Well, that's a different issue, and a very important one, which is only accelerated this week by what's happened in Ottawa. But let's come back to the column first, if we could, before we get back into probably what is the more important issue, which you just raised about, whether the Liberal Party, the current government, is up to the task of negotiating this agreement. But you comment about Trump worrying that Canadian airports have become a way for terrorists and migrants and drugs to get into the United States. I thought it's U.S. Customs that's responsible for, vetting people that are getting on U.S. bound airplanes. So why is he blaming Canada? Should be U.S. Customs should beef up their searches and investigations.
Well, the problem is people fly into Canada and then make their way on foot to the United States. So,
so it's not Canadian airports going to the United States; it's people coming to Canada and then on foot to the U.S.
The government has gone a fairly significant way to relax visa requirements in this country, to bring, as we know, a lot of people in on very short-term visas, on student visas.
Okay, so then why again isn't it the U.S. border patrol responsibility for protecting their border? Not like we don't check people as they leave the country.
Well, we have a long-standing agreement with the United States that we will work together on the issues and the challenges that face the two countries, and that neither country will take measures that would ultimately directly undermine the other country's national interests, security interests, or policy interests. And in this particular case, look, we have virtually no resources between ports of entry in Canada at the border. So it means that there's nobody to intercept people that are looking to come. And if you look at the US data, we have a 600% increase over the course of 3 years in the number of people who are actively being intercepted between ports of entry. Now, you're right. The number is still relatively modest and relatively small compared to what's happening on the southern border. But you can see that this rapid increase. And then you have, in addition to that, people being charged in Canada who are already here on rather dubious grounds, looking to orchestrate terrorist attacks in the United States. You think of, in particular, of the person who was looking to attack Jewish targets in New York, who came into this country under rather questionable visa circumstances, and is currently being detained on national security grounds. Those are all things that really trouble the United States. And the Americans are asking, why are all these people even showing up here? Why do you have an enhanced travel authorization that any non-Canadian, non-US citizen flying into North America is required to fill in when you're not actually then seriously vetting people? And the answer is very simple. The government has tripled the number of people it admits into the country, but has provided no increase in resources for the intelligence and border services that ultimately have to do the vetting for these individuals. So you can imagine you do the sheer math on this. There's simply not the resources to do the sort of due diligence that ultimately is required to make sure that, on the one hand, people are coming to Canada for the legitimate purpose of coming to Canada, rather than using Canada as a loophole to get into the United States, and to make sure that people with nefarious intent don't ever end up showing up here.
So you're saying Trump's right?
I'm saying that there is a definite perception in the United States that Canada has become a threat vector in both individuals as well as illicit trade to the United States. I think the greatest concern for the Trump administration is that ultimately, I think the message is we shouldn't have to worry about the northern border. You're supposed to be our partner. That we have to worry about Mexico and we have a hard time working with Mexico, that's par for the course. But we shouldn't then also have to worry about what's going on the northern border. And the problem for Canada is the United States has so many resources. If the United States wants to do something, they're just going to do it unilaterally. And the way the United States is currently trying to effectively bully Canada into doing the right things is through the tariffs. And if we had a little bit of foresight, or we would actually be able to sit down and negotiate constructively, the person, whether you like the government or not, whether you like the finance minister or not, she did get a negotiated agreement under the first Trump administration. And you might argue that's an agreement that is more robust than perhaps the NAFTA that we had before. But of course, that experienced person, the prime minister, just lost. And so as Canadians, we should be deeply worried. We should be worried when the Premier of Ontario and the Premier of Alberta make unilateral announcements about how they're going to handle those tariff threats, because it clearly shows that premiers do not have confidence in the federal government, let alone in the Prime Minister, to A, take the matter seriously, and B, to have the confidence to negotiate on behalf and in the best interests of all provinces. And that is a problem.
But one premier in Alberta and the other premier in Ontario seem to be taking the opposite tack, one being overly nice, the one being overly firm.
What we want to see is a coordinated approach. You don't want to see one federal government and, take out the couple of provinces that don't have borders with the U.S., say 8 premiers, negotiating in terms of their own interests, and then arguably probably working at cross purposes. You want to see one federal government fully backed by the premiers in terms of its position, both its negotiating position and its policy approach with regards to the Trump administration more broadly, and with regards in particular to issues of organized crime, immigration, border security, defense, intelligence, and the like. And clearly, when you see premiers coming out sort of on their own, it suggests that there's no cohesion, and the Trump administration will see that, and they will exploit that to the fullest.
Is it because there's no cohesion, or because we're overly partisan and everyone wants their own political, get their own political advantage out of the situation?
Look, politicians are ultimately rational choicers. So yes, there's always going to be politicking involved. But I don't think it's ultimately necessary to put the interests, your own interests as a member of parliament or member of provincial parliament, or the interests of your own party ahead of the country. I think those are reconcilable. And we've had previous governments, take for instance, both, I would say, the Mulroney government and the Chrétien government, that were quite adept at reconciling their individual, their party interests, their individual interests as an MP, and the national interest. And it seems that, but that requires heavy lifting. It requires competent leadership. It requires people who can spend a long time sitting down with everybody, figuring out what the common denominator is. And there's no sort of quick fixes that you can just pull out of the hat. And as we know that attention spans appear to be rather short currently, especially at the federal level. And so rightly, the premiers are worried. Look, I mean, in Ontario, 20% of your economy is the car industry, which relies entirely on trade with the United States, and that is highly vulnerable to the tariff threat.
I was at a conference last week. David Frum, a political commentator in the United States, was the keynote speaker, and he said that while there is an incredible desire, natural desire for politicians to say things for personal political advantage, now's not the time. That now's the time they have to speak and should think about the national interest. And in Team Canada, a unified, cohesive strategy is the only way possibly forward when you're up against someone like Donald Trump.
I've always appreciated David Frum, and as you of course know, David Frum is a Canadian. He's a very astute political observer, and I think what I also see David Frum signaling here is the problem of, I would contend that the current federal government has never really had a sense of the national interest. It has long conflated the interests and the electoral interests of the Liberal Party of Canada with the national interest. And that, of course, makes it very difficult to build a national coalition, not just among premiers, but also with the private sector, and get the confidence of Canadians in a way that would be required in order to have a cohesive approach with the Trump administration. So yes, when we talk about the national interest and putting the interests of the common good ahead of the particular good, that actually requires us to have an understanding what that looks like. And I would say that is currently lacking. And that's ultimately where everybody looks to a federal government. And as we all know, that leadership and that vision is in rather short supply.
We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes talking about Canada-US free trade, border security, drugs, and a whole bunch of other interesting issues. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Christian Leuprecht is my guest tonight. He's a professor at the Royal Military College and Queen's University. He's a senior fellow at a think tank called the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and he's a co-editor of a book called Security, Cooperation, Governance, the Canada-United States Open Border Paradox. He's written a really interesting column in the Globe and Mail called "Let's Reassure Our American Neighbors That Canada has their back. And he's been, I'm surprised, pretty critical of what we've done in Canada. And if anything, it sounds like he's agreeing that Donald Trump's allegations about Canada being a source of drugs, of migrants, of criminal organizations is true. And something that I didn't realize to the extent that it is before I read his very well-written column. So I commend it to you. You say that in a recent report to Congress, it highlighted systematic supply chain risks in Canada, and that Canada has become a haven for transnational criminal organizations, and we're frustrating U.S. law enforcement. What's the proof of that?
Well, so if you sit in the US, I mean, we have one of the benefits of this country has long been the very close cooperation with the United States. The problem is we have no resources to dedicate to most of these things. Look at sort of some of the proofs. So look at the super lab bust, for instance, that we recently had in BC, producing fentanyl and other drugs. The interesting thing about this lab is it's a good indication of what the problem is. This lab produces way more than we would actually need for the Cascadia, West Coast Canadian market, British Columbia, Alberta market. So there's a huge incentive for cartels and triads to come to Canada and to overproduce. And then they need to do something with that overproduction, which is they sell it to the United States. But we also know from open source seizures, they sell it to Australia and they sell it to Europe. So Canada has become a top destination, for instance, for fentanyl exports to both Australia and Europe. Just as sort of as an example of sort of one means, the Port of Vancouver has become a key transshipping hub for both precursor chemicals for drugs as well as for the drugs themselves. And it seems that we have neither the will nor the ability nor the intention to actually try to contain this and get a handle on this.
So we don't have drug enforcement.
So we have a federal police force, the RCMP, that spends 85% of its time, resources, and people on doing contract policing for the provinces. That leaves very little bandwidth to actually do the things that you would expect a federal police force in this country to do. So some of these are structural constraints that the way our agencies set up is just not particularly effective for what we're trying to achieve. The RCMP had a very effective financial crime enforcement team, the Integrated Proceeds of Crime team in the late 1990s, run by Gary Clement, who recently wrote a book about this. But the RCMP ultimately disbanded that. I wouldn't say entirely disbanded, but took away sort of some of the key talent. And so as a result, our federal police force lost its ability to do serious financial crime investigations. The problem with financial crime is it's probably the most complex crime you could possibly imagine. Why? Because the bad guys hire very high-priced lawyers and accountants to make all their transactions look perfectly legal. So if you want to track them, and let alone you want to actually detect them, disrupt them, and possibly prosecute people, those are very difficult investigations to run. So you need people who do this for a living, and we simply don't have that sort of attention, those capacities, that particular setup in this country to investigate. The way we know this is the government itself has recognized this. In budget 2019, the government made a big announcement that it was going to overhaul how we're going to go about financial economic crime. Nothing happened. The Financial Crime Coordination Center was announced in budget 2021. To this day, we're still waiting for the federal government to stand it up. There's just not the attention that's actually required. We make all these announcements, but ultimately, look, the government now announced money for border security over the next 6 years. Well, this shows you how long it actually takes to build that capacity. We don't need that capacity in 6 years. We need that capacity now. And building it sort of on the fly here is going to be exceedingly difficult. It can be done, but it will require a huge amount of resources and attention. And clearly, this is not a vote getter, especially for the current government.
You also say that counterfeit products and slave labor and illicit goods are an issue coming from Canada into the United States?
Yeah, so you can read the report for yourself. There's also a separate report by David Lewin and Calvin Krusty on these particular problems. So these are things that don't
slave labor, seriously?
So illicit labor. So people being brought into this country. So for instance, for since 2016 until very recently, it was relatively easy to bring people to Canada on a Mexican passport. Many of those passports were forged. That's sort of a separate problem. But it's a way you get, so we have a significant challenge both in this country and with individuals being brought into this country and then trafficked into the United States for the purpose of essentially engaging in illicit labor. And we have no ability to enforce against this. So this is part of what's human trafficking. There's a whole series of dimensions of human trafficking, and human exploitation for the purposes of labor is one significant challenge. If you want to look it up, we recently had a fairly significant bust in Hamilton on precisely this problem with people being brought to Canada from Eastern Europe and then essentially being trafficked here for labor purposes. So yeah, so these are all things, so on the one hand,
sex trade or just slaves?
These are people who are being made to. So this is slave labor, effectively. So these are people who are not being paid according to Canadian Canadian wage standards, who have to work in dangerous industries and to have to work under conditions that no Canadian would be either willing to or allowed to work in. This is a significant organized crime racket in terms of making money. But look, what's so frustrating is that, of course, the federal government has long made all sorts of announcements about better labor practices around the world. It's concerned about the way minorities are being treated around the world in terms of labor practices. But rather than going around the world and sort of, being preachy about a values-based foreign policy, maybe we should start in our own backyard and send a clear message that this sort of practice will not be tolerated in Canada, and it will not be tolerated that anybody tries to bring someone to this country and then traffic them to the United States for the purpose of having them engage in exploitative labor.
Whether it's going to the United States or staying in Canada, it's wrong no matter what.
And that's the message that a government would need to send. But of course, it's much easier and more popular to make announcements about things and criticize what people are doing in other countries far away than to actually clean up our own backyard.
So what are we going to do about it? What you're suggesting, one of the things you're suggesting is using the Canadian Armed Forces to patrol the border? Really? Canadian Armed Forces patrolling our border?
Well, look what the RCMP has announced. The two announcements it has made in terms of, so the RCMP doesn't have people to provide, right? So if you look at, for instance, British Columbia, the RCMP is currently 8% short on staffing in British Columbia alone. So the RCMP can't even staff the detachments it's supposed to staff. Where's it going to find the people who are going to patrol the border, let alone this extremely long border? Now, of course, you don't have to patrol it equally because we know where the vulnerabilities are. In particular, Swanton sector. So most of the people, for instance, who cross by foot cross from Quebec into New York, Vermont, or New Hampshire, and what's known as the Swanton sector. And Tom Homan, the new border czar that Trump appointed, comes incidentally from the Swanton sector. This is not by accident. What can we do? Well, one of the things so what has the RCMP done? It's announced they're going to send RCMP cadets. So these are not even fully trained police officers, because the only people we have are RCMP cadets, and we're going to send the emergency response team. Now, that's a good allocation of taxpayer money. We're going to take the emergency response team and we're going to have them do patrolling the border between ports of entry. Now, if you're going to patrol a border that is dense with trees and that is in that particular sector hundreds of kilometers long, relatively sparsely populated, that's not going to help you if you don't actually have good intelligence assets to figure out when and where people might be crossing to be able to intercept those. To that effect, you're going to need a variety of electronic assets, possibly including drones, although it's very difficult to fly drones in that section of the border. We can talk about that later. And of course, the Canadian Armed Forces has those capabilities. So if you wanted to deploy them, there is an organization that has intelligence assets that can help you with a more intelligent allocation of the resources that you have. But of course, it would be controversial if you brought out the Canadian Armed Forces to effectively run intelligence along the border, and it would be admitting that the Canada Border Services Agency that's in charge at points of entry and the RCMP that's in charge of the border between ports of entry do not have the capacity and do not have the assets to do what ultimately should have been done a long time ago, which is to make sure that we can secure our own border.
Do we need a wall?
Um, Look, Janet Reno, you might remember a Homeland Security secretary famously said, "Show me a 50-foot wall and I'll show you a 51-foot ladder." A wall is not going to do anything for us. But so you don't want to defend issues and secure the border per se. When people get to the border, it's already too late. Many of these problems we can contain long before they ever get to North America, or we can contain in the various places where some of the illicit activity is happening. But to that effect, you need good intelligence, criminal intelligence, and security intelligence. We know from the Whole Commission what trouble security intelligence sharing in this country is in, and how seriously the political authority takes it or not. And you need real enforcement assets and capabilities. And so, and as I've told you, the RCMP simply is not up to the. I mean, this is just one of many tasks the RCMP has in terms of federal policing. It's 4 federal policing priorities. We have this curious split arrangement where we have one agency in charge at the ports of entry, another agency in charge between ports of entry. That agency is also the police force with the largest span of control of any police force in the democratic world. And I hope you can see how perhaps we are not set up for success.
So what's the solution? The Canadian Armed Forces, I understand, are 50,000 men short, 50,000 people short already. And I've heard the statistic that there are more people in the Canadian Revenue Agency than there are in the Canadian Armed Forces. And so we've got a real problem already in the armed forces. How can we possibly use them at the border?
Well, I mean, under A2 civil power, like there are legal provisions where we bring the armed forces out on a regular basis, for instance, to support various, I mean, your domestic operations, for instance, after floods and the like. So it's not so the armed forces regularly assist government in various types of emergencies.
But if it's a long-term, non-stop issue, we're going to have to dramatically increase personnel in the armed forces.
Or we need to actually pay serious attention to the federal agencies that should be doing this job, but for a host of budget reasons, structural reasons, and the like, have not been able to give it the attention that's required. That's fixable, and it's fixable in short term, but it requires significant amount of money and attention. The armed forces is sort of the easy solution because they're there and you can deploy them. They have the assets that are required. They would be a short-term solution if people are genuinely worried, for instance, about also significant migrant flows from the United States into Canada. What would you rather have? Nobody there to intercept people, or actually having at least some capacity? But there's also something symbolic about the Canadian Armed Forces. Of course, Trump has said he wants to use U.S. Armed Forces or the National Guard or some combination thereof on the southern border. So if Canada deploys its armed forces under to aid civil authorities under the aid of civil power provisions, that would also provide a bit of top cover for Trump to do likewise. And so you can play some politics here and play into Trump's hands, even if you ultimately, I think the way you would use the Canadian Armed Forces is likely not with people on the actual ground, but rather with some of the intelligence assets that they can bring to bear in order to help the few people we actually have to deploy on the ground, so we can optimize those few resources that we can actually dedicate to the border.
So that's people growing across the border. Come back on this organized crime. You also talk again about containing the proliferation of organized crime syndicates operating in Canada, with financial crime being one of the big issues. How do you do that?
Well, so the proliferation of organized crime here really goes back to the 1980s, when we first saw Chinese triads set up shop in British Columbia and then sort of expanding their reach. And Mexican cartels that had already set up before 2016, but when the Prime Minister dropped the visa requirements for Mexicans, that sort of supercharged the operations in Canada, and as did the pandemic, because during the pandemic it was very difficult to get things across the US-Mexico border. So the cartels started producing here in Canada to bring it to Mexico. So we've created, and there's been relatively little ability to detect, disrupt, let alone prosecute individuals here. As you know, the current government has believed that the opposite is better, that you have milder penalties rather than stricter penalties. So look, the former director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service has called Canada a high-value, low-risk jurisdictions, and organized criminals know this. They even use Canadian banks to launder their proceeds. You'll be familiar with the fines fine that the U.S. Attorney General has levied and other criminal and the charge of criminal conspiracy against TD Bank. Of course, if you operate in Canada, the United States, just like any Canadian who might be a snowbird in Florida, you're going to pick a bank that gives you easy access to your money in the United States. The cartels have figured this out as well. And so we've even allowed a permissive financial environment because we've been relatively generous with regards to some of the wrongdoing by our banks. And with our banks, the concern by the Trump administration is that in funding organized crime and aiding and abetting the trafficking of fentanyl, effectively the banks, in this case TD Bank, has become an instrument of the reverse opium wars that China is perpetrating against North America. And so that Canada and Canadian institutions and Canadian threat vectors are ultimately being used to undermine and weaken the United States. And that's ultimately what it comes down for the Trump administration. The concern, the extent to which this is not just happenstance, it's not just organized crime, but it is deliberately being leveraged by America's most important adversary, China, in order to weaken the U.S., weaken U.S. society, undermine U.S. social cohesion, undermine U.S. prosperity, and undermine democratic institutions in the United States. And the United States is saying, enough, Canada, you need to step up. We've worked together protecting the continent.
Hold on. The reverse opium wars. So the opium wars were effectively the United Kingdom, Britain, forcing China to open up to opium. What you're saying is China is forcing the United States to open up to fentanyl?
China has been engaging this. Look, I mean, Brian, this is well documented. That so fentanyl doesn't distribute. It's not a random distribution problem across the world. It is a particular problem in North America, highly concentrated in North America. In China, fentanyl is illegal in China. There are 3 entities that are allowed to produce it for medical purposes. There are 169 entities that have licenses for the purpose of producing it for export. Much of that export is in the form of precursor chemicals that these 169 entities produce that end up in Mexico and in Canada. So this is not by happenstance that we have a fentanyl crisis in North America. This is a deliberate effort, including by the United Front Work Department, to undermine North American society. And that is precisely where the concern by the Americans is, that Canada has been rather naive in the way it has allowed its rather weak regulation and jurisdiction and enforcement being leveraged by China to undermine the United States.
This is a concerted effort by China to weaken North American society.
We are under daily attack by the regime in Beijing. The regime in Beijing is doing everything it can to weaken our social cohesion, to polarize our society, to undermine our prosperity, and to undermine the integrity and legitimacy of our political and democratic institutions. This is a cohesive, systematic effort, and this is something that as Canadians we need to get wise to. The Americans have gotten wise to this quite some time ago. The problem is it's become much more difficult to, if you want, attack the United States in that regard, because the United States is more aware and it has much more robust security and intelligence institutions, whereas Canada has become a nice weak target. And if you have a hard time going after the United States, going after Canada is just as easy, because as you can see, if you bring your fentanyl precursors into Canada, they're relatively easy then to move the product into the United States, combine it with all the other weaknesses around migration, around financial crime, and the like that we've talked about. And the United States, I think, has reason to be concerned about the trends that we're seeing in this country with regards to illicit trade and other threat vectors to the United States.
Incredible. Under daily attack. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes. Fascinating conversation today about Trump's threats of a trade war with Canada to force us to beef up our borders. And our guest is effectively saying, Trump's right. We got some problems here that we got to address. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Christian Leuprecht, Professor Christian Leuprecht of the Royal Military College and Queen's University is my guest tonight. We're talking about the Canada-U.S. border and Donald Trump's threats to put on big tariffs because he thinks that our border is pretty weak, and it's a sieve for drugs, for money laundering, for slave labor. My gosh, it's an incredible accusation. Professor, I got to ask you, the head of the president of Mexico sort of put it on the United States in a letter that she sent. And she said the problem is the demand in the United States for fentanyl. So she was taking the blame, it would appear, off of the producer and saying the problem is you've got to get your society under control and take away the demand for fentanyl. What do you say to that, sir?
Look, as I often point out, we live next door to the largest weapons market in the world. And so the reason why Mexico and Canada have this outsized problem with shootings and with the illicit uses of firearms is that these firearms come from the United States. Something that the federal government clearly doesn't appreciate is that banning firearms in Canada, legal firearms in Canada, is going to do nothing about the flow of illicit firearms from the United States. So yes, the Mexican president is correct that there's a significant, I mean, the U.S. is the largest single market in the world anywhere. And so naturally, there's also going to be a sizable market for all sorts of things, including illicit goods in the United States. At the same time, I would say, you say that I'm saying Trump is right. I would say it actually doesn't matter whether I think Trump is right or not. What matters is the U.S. is unilateral. And we're going to have to live with the Trump administration for the next 4 years. And this is how the Trump administration, the people close to Trump, especially the people close to Trump who have an understanding and appreciation of Canada, think about the world. This is the reality that we ultimately have to deal with. And so simply saying it is not happening is not going to convince these folks to think differently. And simply saying that we'll get, which is basically the announcement today, look, we have a 6-year plan, we'll eventually get a handle on it, is also not going to be good enough. We need to think about today, what is it that we can do tomorrow so that when the president is sworn in on January 20th, we can dissuade him from imposing tariffs and we can show him that we are actually serious about the concerns that the Trump administration has voiced about Canada.
Okay, so the question is then how do you deal with it? Let's use a couple of different scenarios. Some people think that if someone's a bully, you stand up to a bully, and that appears to be Doug Ford's strategy is tit for tat, that you stand up to the threats of these big tariffs with threats of tariffs going back or restrictions of energy. If you got a narcissist or a megalomaniac, some people say you go cater to his ego. And so you fly down to Mar-a-Lago and you have dinner with him and you cater to him, which is what a lot of Republicans have done in the Republican Party. And that's obviously what Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, did to try to, cater to his ego. And then other people just want to make nice, whether that be Pierre Poilievre or the premier of Alberta. What you're saying is just do what he wants, which is put up the border, put up the walls.
Well, we need to show that we're not tone deaf. We need to show that we take seriously the concerns that are being voiced. But ultimately, we want to make sure we assert our own sovereignty in doing so. So I think it doesn't actually matter so much what exactly we do, rather than to say, hey, we hear you, and B, we have a plan, and C, this plan is going to work. That's what we did after 9/11. It's also what we did during the first Trump administration. And so I am hopeful that if we're able to demonstrate that to the Trump administration will effectively relent from its threat of tariffs. I do not think that starting a trade war with the United States is strategically prudent, because ultimately we're going to lose. Yes, look, tariffs will hurt the United States. Tariffs, there's no doubt that imposing tariffs on goods from Canada, the United States, and Mexico will hurt the consumer in the United States. But look at oil exports, for instance. 20% or so, 25% of U.S. oil comes from Canada. But of course, for Canada, almost all our oil exports go to the United States. So the pain for us is going to be way bigger than it is for the United States. And so this idea that we can somehow threaten the United States with retaliation is, in my view, terrible when it's relatively straightforward to do the right thing. The problem about doing the right thing, especially for the current federal government, is that it would require the federal government to admit that a number of its key policy planks have been a failure, and that ultimately a very serious course correction, immediate course correction, is required. Doing that for a minority government that's already beleaguered and that will soon have to contest a federal election is highly improbable in terms of its electoral fortunes. And so I think it is much more politically expedient to try to have this sort of retaliation measures where we're ultimately going to lose. Whereas if we actually all behaved like adults, insofar that we can deal with the Trump presidency on those terms, I think we learned from the first term that it is entirely possible to deal with Donald Trump and to find a solution that will ultimately appease the concerns of the Trump administration while safeguarding Canadian prosperity. I just think the political climate in this country doesn't lend itself to that currently.
So David Frum last week, as I mentioned, made a speech on this, and his comment was that Trump's threat on migrants and deportation may not actually happen, but it doesn't matter because all those migrants are making their decisions about what to do between now and January the 20th, because the last thing they want to do is be deported on January the 21st and separated from their family and spend time in deportation camps. And so he said, you're going to have waves of migrants coming to Canada. That's the problem that you've got to address. Do you agree?
I certainly think that the Prime Minister has finally woken up to the border and to the challenges that the border presents in terms of flows in both directions, to the United States and from the United States. The problem is, of course, that this is a Prime Minister who previously politicized that particular issue during the first Trump administration and effectively invited people to make their way to Canada. And a Prime Minister that for the longest time held out on plugging the loopholes in the Safe Third Country Agreement. So we can see, much of this will actually depend. The bulk of people who would make their way to Canada would not, under current rules, be allowed to claim asylum in this country. So will the Prime Minister actually apply the Constitution and the rule of law in terms of also his own rules that he has imposed in the renegotiation of the Safe Third Country Agreement, or is he going to politicize the issue for electoral gain? So I think ultimately we have the measures in place. We just need to actually stick to our own rules that we have already made as a sovereign country.
Take a step back for a second, explain to everyone what the Safe Third Country rules are.
So the principle of the Safe Third Country Agreement, which was developed originally in Europe, is that you have to claim your asylum or refugee status in the first safe country in which you arrive. For just about anybody who would make their way to Canada, that country would be the United States. So under those rules, you would not be allowed to claim in Canada. There are 3 exceptions under which you can present at a port of entry. So for instance, if you have relations here, if you're an unaccompanied minor. So there are some nuances where you can still, even if you're in the United States, lodge a legal claim here. But 99% of people who might make their way to Canada on or before or after January 20th would not qualify for refugee status under the current rules. There is a peculiarity in the current rules that if somehow you can hide in Canada for 14 days and then lodge a claim inland, then you're allowed to lodge a claim. This was a curious compromise that was negotiated for reasons that need not detain us here. So that would be a loophole that would be useful for the Prime Minister to plug at this point. And so for us, basically, to send a message that do not come to this country for the sole purpose of trying to escape the Trump administration. There are reasons under which you may lodge refugee status, but they are very limited. And if you show up here and you do not qualify under those few exemptions that exist, we will turn you around and we will hand you to U.S. authorities. And guess what U.S. authorities are going to do? By the end of the day, they will have you on a plane.
So it was interesting at the same conference, the chief economist of the CIBC made a presentation about immigration. And he said that he didn't believe the Canadian immigration numbers because the Canadian immigration numbers to be true, given this reduction in the population that is projected by the federal government, we needed to make sure that a whole bunch of these student immigrants, student visas and visitor visas actually leave the country. And he says, we never deported people since World War II. And so I don't think we're going to have mass deportations in Canada. We're not going to force them out. And so the immigration levels aren't going to go down the way that the federal government has been projecting. If he's right, that Canadians won't stomach deportation of people on visitor visas or student visas, are they going to stomach deportation of migrants coming to Canada asking for asylum here from the United States and from Donald Trump?
So in most of these cases, we would simply be able to turn people around and hand them to U.S. authorities, and the U.S. authorities could make their decision on what it is that they wanted to do with individuals. Look, deportation has never been our strength. It has never also been the strength of many other Western countries. In 2019, when I wrote my study on Roxham Road for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, we had about, I'm just trying to recall the numbers, we had about 40,000 deportation orders out, and we deported, I think, about 1,600 people that year.
Hold it. Say that again. 40,000 deportation orders and only 1,600.
You can look at the numbers, look at my Roxham Road paper. It's on the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's website. So those are roughly the numbers.
3.5%.
So those would be numbers dating back to about 2018. Of course, in the meantime, we know that the numbers have mushroomed, but our resources to deport people have not. And so the number of deportation orders that we would have out today would be significantly larger than it would have been back then. Now, this is not all because we don't have resources. For instance, many people come from countries that simply won't issue travel papers to their citizens, and so we can't deport someone if we don't actually have travel papers to send someone to whatever country we want to send them from. There are measures where you can play hardball. The European Union and the United States use much more aggressive measures to try to make sure countries now take back their citizens. So we could partner with the United States and with the European Union. But so far, look, we've always presented ourselves as a smart Canadian. It's been really hard to kind of get to this country. And if somehow you find your way here, then we took you in and we treated you as a future Canadian, and we basically integrated you, unless you were already a criminal or you committed some serious offense sort of while you were here. The challenge is we could do that because the numbers were very small. As you know now, the numbers of claims are astronomical in terms of the backlog we already have. If we now have a significant flow of people into this country, it will completely undermine the immigration system, because people make a basic fundamental assumption about the border, which is that governments have a handle on their border. If you want to see a populist right-wing shift in this country on the next election, just wait for large streams of migrants making their way to Canada, and Canadians having the perception that the Canadian government has either no intention or no ability to do anything about this. So I think it would be terrible for the integrity of our democratic and political institutions for Canada not to be able to send a clear signal that we have a handle on our borders and that we will follow the rules, and to send a clear message, contrary to what the Prime Minister tweeted out in the early Trump administration, that most people will not qualify under the rules that are currently in place. So there's no point in making your way to Canada.
Professor, I think you're waking us up to this reality. Thank you very much. We're going to take a final break for some messages. We'll be back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Christian Leuprecht, Professor Christian Leuprecht from the Royal Canadian Military College and Queen's University is my guest. He's written a great column on what we've got to do with the border, and we've been having a really good conversation. I got to ask you, though, I come back to David Frum. David Frum's comment was, now's the time to put partisan differences and political advantage behind us, gather around the flag, be Team Canada, and approach the United States as one unified force. Sounds to me like you just don't think that's possible with our current government.
We will only solve these issues if we work together with the United States. And the United States will always be unilateral. With Biden, it might be unilateralism with a smile. With Trump, it'll be unilateralism with a frown. But the U.S. is always unilateral. So we always have to assert our sovereignty and our interests. But look, the reason why we are so prosperous and desirable a continent is not by accident. It's because at the beginning of World War II, we made a decision to work together with the United States to protect this continent from threats from abroad. And it has made this continent arguably the most harmonious, prosperous, politically stable society that the world has ever known. No surprise that so many people want to come here. We can only protect that if ultimately we are able to assert the rules that the elected citizens in both countries have decided their governments are going to make, and for us to find a common ground on how we reconcile those priorities. We have 200 years of practice at this. We've done great on this since the 1940s, in particular, in terms of working together. I have full confidence that if both sides put their mind to it and have real political will and interest to find common ground, we did it after 9/11. We did it during the first Trump administration. We can do it again.
Probably a stupid question, Professor, but when I was a political science student way back, decades and decades ago, I wrote a paper that said I thought we should have open borders between Canada and the United States, comparable to the European Union. Any chance of that?
We have, I probably wouldn't characterize as an open border, but the reason why our border is so open to us as Canadians, as individuals for trade, is because it is a well-managed, well-administered border that runs in the interests of both parties along both sides of the border, where we have common goals, common aims, parallel policy and institutional structures, and we've built one common border regime to ensure we keep that border open for legal purposes, legal traffic by individuals, legal trade, and that's ultimately what we need to double down on together.
Christian Leuprecht, thank you so much. This has been great. I got to read your book. Remind us all, what's the name of your book, please, sir?
Security, Cooperation, Governance, the Canada-United States Open Border Paradox. It's available open access from University of Michigan Press, so you don't even need to pay for it.
I've been saying this for a while, everybody, and the professor tonight has said it far, far better than I, but I think we got to get serious. We got to get serious in funding our military. We got to get serious in funding our police. And we got to get serious about the border. And I think if we don't do it, we're going to be in for a very, very tough couple of years. And so, Professor, thank you so much for joining us tonight, everybody. That's our show for tonight. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Kingston at www.saga960am.ca. And all my podcasts and videocasts go up on my website, briancrombie.com, and on social media and on YouTube and on podcast servers as soon as the radio show goes to air. Good night, everybody. Thank you, Professor. You're excellent.
Been a pleasure.